Hi, I'd like to make a series of videos about the endgame, about basic endgames. And the reason is that I think there's a trap a lot of beginner and intermediate players fall into. And that's the trap of thinking, sorry, I have one of my cats here. That's the trap of thinking that the way to become better at chess is to study the opening. I think they implicitly believe that if only they study the opening well enough, they'll have the entire game mapped out from beginning to end, and become better players in that way. The problem with that line of reasoning is that the game is too complex for it to be humanly possible for someone to do that. So a better approach to becoming better at the game is to understand the simplest positions, and then use your understanding of those simple positions to build up an understanding of more complex ones. So what I focus on with a lot of my students is basic endgames. Endgames that are extremely simple, but that a surprising number of people don't understand. What we're going to look at today is the simplest kind of endgame you can get in the game of chess, and that's an endgame in which, apart from the kings, there's only one pawn on the board. In this position, white has a pawn on c2, his king on c3, and there's a black king on c5. And the question is, what is the evaluation of this position? Well, of course, black's not winning, because black doesn't have checkmating material. There's nothing black can use to checkmate white, so black's best hope is a draw. White, however, might be able to win by queening his pawn. And so the question is, will black achieve his goal, which is to draw the game, or will white win? And as it turns out, this is a kind of important single pawn position because the evaluation depends on whose turn it is to move. If it's white to move, black will achieve a draw, and if it's black to move, white will win. And this is because of a concept known as the opposition. Whenever you see, in an endgame, the two kings squared off against each other like this, neither king can make progress up the board from his point of view. So white can't move his king to b4, or c4, or d4, and neither can black. And the person who is said to have the opposition is the person whose turn, in a position like this, it is not to move. So if it's white's turn to move here, black is said to have the opposition because the black king is preventing the white king from making progress. And if it's black to move, then white has the opposition for the same reason. Okay, the position I have set up here is with white to move. So what I'm going to be showing you first is why this is a draw if black has the opposition. Okay, so first of all, white can move his king back and forth in front of his pawn. But the problem is that black can maintain the opposition, as they say, which just means reestablish the opposition every time the white king moves. And the problem is that the white king will never be able to make progress up the board this way. King c3, king c5, king d3, king d5. No progress. So white has not succeeded in advancing his king ahead of his pawn toward the queening square of the white pawn, which is an important idea in an endgame like this. Which means that white is forced to advance his pawn ahead of his king, for example with c4 check. And now the way you draw this position with black is by following a list of 4 priorities. What you do is you go down the list, you find the highest priority you're capable of doing, and you do that. And if you follow that list all the way through this endgame, you reach a drawn position without a problem. That priority list is number 1, capture the pawn, or take the pawn. Number 2, put your king 1 square in front of the pawn. Number 3, put your king 2 squares in front of the pawn. And number 4 is take the opposition. So let's see how that works in practice. It's black's turn to move. He can't follow priority number 1. He can't capture the pawn. So he goes with priority number 2, places his king 1 square in front of the pawn. White makes a move, in this case king c3. Black can't do priority number 1. He's already on the square 1 space in front of the pawn, so he can't do priority number 2. So he goes with priority number 3, 2 spaces in front of the pawn. White advances with his king. Black can't go with priority number 1 or priority number 2 or priority number 3, and so black takes the opposition. White plays c5 check. Black can't take the pawn, so he steps on the square in front. Then he steps 2 squares in front. Then he takes the opposition. You may be noticing a pattern here. But it doesn't necessarily have to follow that pattern. Black steps 1 square in front, 2 squares in front. White can make some other move. And as long as every time, as black, you follow this list of priorities and do the thing highest on the list, you will achieve a draw. Black can't take the pawn, but he can step on the square 1 space in front, so he does. 2 spaces in front, the opposition, 1 space in front, and now we've reached this critical position in which white either has to abandon the defense of his pawn or deliver stalemate. For example, king a5, and black finally gets to go with the highest priority on his list, which is capture the pawn. Draw. Okay, so going back to the beginning, this position is a draw, and it's very easy for black to draw if he knows that list of priorities. And one of my students came up with a nice acronym that you can use in order to remember the list of priorities, and that's the acronym TOTO. T-O-T-O. The first priority is take the pawn. The second one is 1 square in front of the pawn, which is O. The third one is 2 squares in front, T. And the fourth is opposition, O. So T-O-T-O, TOTO. And if you remember that, it's very easy to blitz out this endgame from the black side. For example, opposition, 1 in front, 2 in front, opposition, 1 in front, 2 in front, 1 in front, 2 in front, 1 in front, 2 in front, opposition, 1 in front, 2 in front, opposition, 1 in front, and we've reached this critical position in which either stalemate must be delivered or the pawn has to be abandoned. For example, king c6 stalemate. Okay, that's simple enough, but let's see what happens if it's the other way around. If white has the opposition, which means black has to move first. Okay, so let's say, as I said before, black has to move first here, so white has the opposition. And unfortunately for black, that means his king has to allow the white king to make progress up the board. I mentioned earlier that kind of ideal for white is that he makes progress toward the queening square of the white pawn, so that he can kind of escort the pawn in using his king. So let's say black plays king b5 here. The black king is still guarding c4 and b4, but unfortunately is no longer guarding d4, so the white king makes progress up the board. Black can try to come back and stop the white king from making any more progress, but the problem for black is that white can re-establish the opposition. And now we have the same kind of position, except the kings are 1 more rank up the board. Black has to give way again. White makes progress up the board. Black can try to come back and stop the white king, but white can retake the opposition. This pattern repeats itself, and if it gets all the way up the board, we end up achieving a position in which white will be winning whether he has the opposition or not. And let's switch to another analysis board so I can show you that. Whenever you have a pawn on the 5th rank, with your king on the square in front of it, and the pawn is a non-rook pawn, meaning a pawn on the B, C, D, E, F, or G file, you are winning regardless of the position of the enemy king and regardless of whose turn it is to move. In this case, if it's white's turn to move, white simply steps to the side. Black can maintain the opposition, but white advances his pawn. Black can step on the space 2 squares in front of the pawn, but white will advance his pawn again, and unfortunately black here is in what's called Zugzwang, which means he has to move, but he doesn't want to. Black only has 1 legal move, king b7, after which white can play king d7 and queen his pawn on the following move. If this position is black to move, it's even easier. Black will have to give way, white's king will make progress up the board, and afterwards the white king will escort the pawn in to become a queen. So, if we head back to this position, you can see that now that white's king is on the 6th rank, once he brings his pawn up to the 5th rank, he has a winning position no matter whose turn it is to move and no matter the position of the black king, which means that white can leave his king on c6 and simply move his pawn up the board, and he knows that when his pawn gets to the 5th rank with his king on c6, he's going to be winning. So let's say king d8, c4, king c8, c5. There isn't really any calculation necessary here for white because he's winning no matter what. In this case, king b8, king d7, king b7, c6 check, and c7 and c8 queen are unavoidable. Okay, so in this position, with white to move, black has the opposition, and the proper result, if both players play well, is a draw. With black to move, white has the opposition, and that means black can't stop the white king from making progress up the board. I showed you already that if black tries to come back and stop the white king from making progress up the board, white just retakes the opposition over and over again and has no problem winning the game. There's one more option for black, which is that he can try to run after the pawn with his king. In this case, it doesn't really make a lot of sense because white can immediately play c4, and black can't make any more progress up the board toward the pawn. But let's say that for whatever reason, because I don't want to set up a new position, let's just say white were compelled to play the move c3, which means black gets to play this move, king b5, intending king c4 and king takes c3. If you ever end up in this kind of position, you can always just kind of reset things by moving your king backwards, king d5. Now black has nothing better than to go king to b6, white can advance his pawn to c4, black can come back and try to stop the white king from making progress, but white retakes the opposition with king c5. And we have the same kind of position that existed a moment ago, a few ranks earlier on the board. White is just now closer to winning the game. So for example, king d7, king b6, king c8, king c6. And now with the white king on c6, as soon as white puts his pawn on c5, it doesn't matter where the black king is, and it doesn't matter whose turn it is to move, white's winning the game. King d8, for example, c5, king c8, king d6, king d8, c6, king c8, c7, king b8, king d7. Simple enough once you get used to it. It might seem intimidating at first, but this kind of thing is important to know about, because look how many moves into the game we've gone. In this particular variation, it's 17 moves. Imagine if, as a 1400 rated player or a 1600 rated player or something similar, you were faced with the prospect of not only calculating from whatever position you're in right now, but getting to this kind of basic endgame and then calculating 17 more moves. That would be kind of an intimidating prospect. But if you understand these endgames in advance, you don't have to do the calculation. So if you can reach this position in your calculation and understand that the evaluation depends on whose turn it is to move, and understand that in this position, white's winning no matter whose turn it is to move, you have a foundation of endgame knowledge that will help you understand more complex positions. There's one more thing to mention, which is that sometimes, obviously, the player with the pawn will have a rook pawn. Rook pawns in general in chess are more drawish than other pawns, because they tend to offer the defender better chances for things like stalemate. In this position, it doesn't matter whose turn it is to move. I think I happen to have it set up with white to move, but it doesn't matter at all. Black can follow that same Toto list of priorities in order to draw if he wants to, but much easier when white's got a rook pawn is for black to just head to the corner and step in and out of the corner over and over again until the game's a draw. For example, king a6, a4, king a7, king b4, king a8, king b5, king b7, a5, king a8. Black's just dancing in and out of the corner. King b6, king b8, a6, king a8, and a7, a move which, were the pawn on the b file, the c file, the d file, the e file, the f file, or the g file, would be winning, because the black king would be forced, to move diagonally forward from his point of view, allowing white to take control of the queening square and win the game, is stalemate in this position. And white can try to dance around a little bit, but the problem is that if he advances with his king to c7, black will go win the pawn. And if he steps back, black will just dance in and out of the corner endlessly until you reach threefold repetition, or the pawn is won, or stalemate is delivered. For example, with king a6. Okay, so that's how things work when there's one pawn on the board. And in the future, we'll go into basic rook endgames, basic queen endgames, and I'll start discussing how to use knowledge of these endgames to build up an understanding of more complex ones. Thanks a lot.